What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so a lot of people don't know this happened. And in fact, I didn't even really know this happened. I was just going through and looking for like all the different tie-ins for Blackest Night. And I just kind of stumbled across this, like a Red Lantern Superboy-Prime. And it's crazy the way this happened. So we need to do a little bit of history here. So Superboy-Prime was an interesting character back when he first popped up. I mean, we've talked about how he came from like Earth Prime, which was basically the real world before Crisis on Infinite Earths. The problem was that Crisis on Infinite Earths got rid of the multiverse and it destroyed his universe along with it. And so he was kind of shuffled off to this paradise dimension. It was supposed to be heaven. And the result was that he came back some 20 years later by Geoff Johns with regards to the Infinite Crisis story. Now, the way that he was done, the way that he was written by Geoff Johns is he was designed to be the comic book reader looking at the world of comic books. And it was literally this idea, and I would even go as far as to say that Superboy-Prime represented Geoff Johns himself in the sense that it was basically Johns looking at the way heroes used to be before Crisis on Infinite Earths and saying they've lost their way. Superheroes are darker, they're grittier. And so with those waters being murky, Superboy-Prime in the Paradise Dimension basically just watched everything unfold. And as he began to watch things, he began to realize that because of the fact that he read comic books in the real world, in our world basically, and the superheroes that he remembers are not the way superheroes are now, he basically came to the conclusion that the superheroes are not superheroes. They're basically bad guys masquerading as good guys. That was the whole motivation behind his character during the events of Infinite Crisis. Now, of course, in the process, he became a bad guy himself. I mean, he literally killed however many superheroes. It took 2 Supermen and 50 Green Lanterns to stop him, but it was still a pretty epic conflict. The issue with this was that once Superboy-Prime was defeated, DC didn't really know what to do with him because he came from an Earth that didn't exist anymore. This went into Sinestro Corps War, which we already covered on my channel. Of course, we covered both Infinite Crisis and Sinestro Corps War, and you'll find both of those in the Green Lantern playlist down in the description. But the idea was that Superboy-Prime basically joined the Sinestro Corps. He was effectively brought back because of the fact that he instilled so much fear in people. He was a perfect candidate for the Yellow Lanterns. The problem again was that once the story finished, he was just kind of shuffled off to the multiverse, never to be seen or heard from again. But because of the fact that Infinite Crisis brought the multiverse back and Final Crisis made the heroes aware of the fact that the multiverse was back, what ended up happening is DC brought him back in a story called Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds. Now, this was designed for the purpose of basically sending him back to his own universe. And the way that it played out, it was basically him just fighting a version of himself from like the 31st century or something along those lines. And that was really about it. But what the conflict did is it basically created this sort of paradox in the sense that if he's fighting himself, then it kind of just resulted in this massive, expansive energy or something along those lines, some end comic book explanation that just made sense at the time. And it just shuffled him back to his own universe. Now, that's where this picks up because the Earth Prime that exists after Infinite Crisis is basically the exact same Earth Prime that existed before Crisis on Infinite Earths. Because the universe is used so infrequently, DC could get away with it. Earth Prime as it existed before Crisis on Infinite Earths and Earth Prime as it exists now, these are the only 2 times we've ever seen it. So DC could kind of do whatever they wanted to. It's not like they had to basically make things match up because characters come from that universe all the time. It didn't work that way. And so what ends up happening is that Superboy-Prime basically picks up in his home universe. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that because of the fact that he had basically been transported from the real world into the world of comics, his life, everything that he had done was recorded in comic book form. And so that's exactly how this plays out. The friends and family of Superboy-Prime now know what he's done. They basically watched him become a villain. The result is that they knew what he was capable of once they basically realized that he has powers and that once he returns back to the real world, he'll still have those powers. It absolutely terrified them. But in the case of Superboy-Prime, he's literally reading adventure comics. He's reading this story where essentially it's the events of Blackest Night, but he also doesn't know what's going to happen. He's reading the story about himself. And that's what's so weird about this is because it's basically this idea that he is visited by Alexander Luthor. Now, of course, the whole point behind all this is it really just kind of runs over his origin story to a degree, a lot of the stuff that we just covered. But Alexander Luthor was basically a version of Lex Luthor from a different universe where, he was basically a good guy. It was where all the other superheroes were bad guys and Lex Luthor was the good guy. The result is that during the events of Infinite Crisis, he switched over to being a bad guy. Ultimately, he was killed by the Joker because Alexander Luthor wouldn't let the Joker into, his group of villains, whatever it is. But what ended up happening here is that when the Black Lantern rings showed up on Earth, they immediately started bonding themselves to a litany of other people, one of whom was Alexander Luthor. Now remember, for those of you guys who were just joining us in our story about Blackest Night, this is basically the rise of the Black Lantern Corps. It's this prophecy of Blackest Night coming to fruition. From the time that Green Lantern Rebirth back in 2000 and whatever, written by Geoff Johns, was first introduced, all the way up to right now, it's been this idea that there's been this prophecy called the prophecy of Blackest Night, that there will be all these other Lantern Corps that will start to rise up, and it will essentially instigate this war of light. But while that war of light is going on, the Black Lanterns will rise, and the Black Lanterns will basically begin converting everybody to the Black Lantern Corps, the core that represents death. And in turn, they will kill all sentient life, which means the emotional spectrum will cease to exist and all life will die within the DC universe. So it's really like the end of times story. It's an apocalyptic story. But the overall goal here, the overall concept here is that because Alexander Luthor was the person who held such a close connection to Superboy-Prime, because Alexander Luthor was the one that pushed him along this path of becoming a bad guy, this basically creates a scenario where if anybody is going to try to convert Superboy-Prime, it's gonna be Alexander Luthor. This also hits at the idea that Superboy-Prime's parents are absolutely terrified of him. Now, the other implication here is that he had basically lashed out at his girlfriend Lori. What they simply say is after what he did to Lori. So we kind of have to assume that that's true, that he had lashed out in a fit of anger and attacked his girlfriend. But regardless of the circumstances, it's put both Lori herself and his parents in a climate of complete and total fear all the time, because they don't know if he's just going to freak out and attack them, possibly kill them. They don't know exactly what it is that he's going to do. But showing up in this comic book store and freaking out because issue number 5 isn't out yet and he wants to know what happens, with the story not being released, the only thing you could do is go on the internet and look up spoilers. Now, of course, this results in the arrival of Alexander Luthor. And again, that's kind of the cool thing here, because what this does is it begins hitting at the nature of Superboy-Prime in terms of how some people viewed him, as well as how he was written as a character. And the way it happens is that for reasons that are never explained, Alexander Luthor just reinstates Superboy-Prime's powers. Now, it's kind of a weird scenario because the way it was left off in terms of him being shunted back to his own universe after the events of Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds, the implication was that his powers would return. And it seems like they flared up occasionally, but he's never returned to like his Superboy-Prime self. And so with Alexander Luthor doing whatever it is that he does, this basically sets Superboy-Prime back to the way he was. And that's cool because this leads to a real world fight in the DC multiverse between Superboy-Prime and Alexander Luthor. So what's going on right here is equivalent to you walking down to your local comic book store and seeing Superboy-Prime and Alexander Luthor beating the crap out of one another. But again, this also hits at the nature of his character. The biggest issue that people have, that a lot of people have with Superboy-Prime, is he started out as a great character and then immediately progressed to just your stereotypical angsty teenager. But in the midst of all this, what we end up doing is get our first introductions into the idea of Black Lantern rings bonding to living hosts. But so far, the Black Lantern rings only pick up on individuals who are dead, or at least who have died somewhere along the line. The notion of a Black Lantern ring bonding itself to a human host shouldn't necessarily be possible, because a person who's alive cannot rise from the dead. But that's the basis of Blackest Night, the idea of converting the living to the dead. So again, that's why it's sort of interesting. But of course, with Alexander Luthor also comes all these other members of the Black Lantern Corps, and it's basically just people that Superboy-Prime has killed over the course of his life, being a vigilante and attacking people and so on and so forth. But when this Black Lantern ring tries to bond itself to Superboy-Prime, what should happen is the ring should dominate him. That's what's supposed to happen. That's how it's supposed to take place. But with all these things being told to Superboy-Prime, he's a caveat, that he's basically just this MacGuffin. He's a plot device. He serves no real useful purpose in the DC landscape. His purpose was to serve a story, and then nobody ever knew what to do with him ever since. It literally turns him on his head, because initially the Black Lantern ring bonds to him, but in his anger and in his power, he starts cycling through all these emotions until he overpowers the Black Lantern ring and turns it into a Red Lantern ring. And that's something that I do not believe we've ever seen before. Now, a lot of this is really designed to hit home at what we've already talked about with regards to Superboy-Prime. This idea that Superboy-Prime is just a plot device, so writers will just write him however they want to in order to write whatever story it is they want to write. And that's really what kind of goes on here. The idea that Superboy-Prime is so incredibly powerful that he can dominate a Black Lantern ring and he can force the Black Lantern ring to be something else. That's just the power that he possesses. And if you guys notice here, while this story predates DC Rebirth by, several years, this basically gives us this sort of look at like what the Phantom Ring does. For those of you guys who are not familiar with Green Lantern or the Green Lantern mythos in DC Rebirth, there is a lantern ring that's only recently been introduced. It's a new concept and it's called the Phantom Ring. And instead of all the other rings choosing people, where like a person has to be able to overcome fear to use a Green Lantern ring, where a person has to be able to instill fear to use a Yellow Lantern ring, the Phantom Ring just allows a person to use whatever, part of the emotional spectrum they want to. It would be like if anybody could walk up and just lift Thor's hammer. And so because of this, the Phantom Ring cycles through all the different aspects of the emotional spectrum based on whatever emotion the wearer is feeling at the time. Now, the Phantom Ring requires the wearer to be in absolute control of their emotions 100% of the time, lest they lose control, which is exactly what we saw happen. But the way that you see things playing out right now with Superboy-Prime is exactly the way the Phantom Ring works. He cycles through all these emotions because one, he's afraid that Alexander Luthor is right. He does not want Alexander Luthor to be right because he wants to be the center of the universe. He loves the idea of being the center of the universe, but he also loves the idea of Lori Lemon, of the woman that he has in his life. He has the willpower to overcome all these different obstacles. He's angry at the fact that maybe Alexander Luthor is right. He feels compassion because of the fact that he has guilt for the things that he's done. He starts cycling through all these emotions, and it's really cool to see because it's literally this massive swarm of power that just totally obliterates Alexander Luthor and all the other Black Lanterns. The problem with this is that this is it. This is really all there is, just because of the fact that once all this happens, he literally just destroys the Black Lantern ring with all the power that he has. And the result is that he's actually met by the arrival of Lori Lemon. And again, that's kind of the crazy thing here, is because she basically pops up and says, well, hey, they sent me to tell you that there's nothing wrong with anything, that everything's going to be okay, that they're going to basically make sure that you're left alone and you're never bothered again. But what Superboy-Prime doesn't realize is that Lori Lemon's wearing a Black Lantern ring. So she's basically a Black Lantern hellbent on converting him into one. So again, that's where the story ends. It really just kind of stops all of a sudden. Like it just ends. And that's really about it. There's no winding down. There's no things sort of wrapping up. It just stops. And that's it. It's kind of disappointing. So I don't know what happens next. I can't tell you guys what ends up taking place next. But with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.